Welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, John O'Doherty, who comes all the way from California and from the Caltech Institute of Technology, and that today will present some of his work on how the human brain takes decision. The floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eva. And I'd like to thank Eva and David and Patrick and everybody for inviting me here. It's great to be back in Geneva. I was just saying it's over 10 years since I've been here, and it's amazing to see your new building and all the amazing stuff that's going on here. Really, really awesome. So today, what I want to talk about is an argument that has, I think, long been made in cognitive science and neuroscience in various forms, which is that we can think of our brain as a mixture of different experts that knows about different things about the world, has different expertise, and can solve problems in different ways. And that a large part of what our brain has to do, and particularly our prefrontal cortex, is work out what experts do we need to use to solve a given problem, and then maybe assign some control over the most relevant experts. So, the way I like to kind of think about this is if you have a task that needs to be done, let's say you want to build a house. During the pandemic, I used to watch all these house building shows and TV shows of people trying to build a house, and it usually fails and everything goes wrong. And it's always kind of fun to see that. So imagine you have, a project manager that's trying to build this house, and the project manager basically has to coordinate all these different experts with who can do different things, like a plumber, electrician, carpenter, roofer, and so on. And they basically have to schedule them and coordinate them so that the right person is doing the right job, right? So if you want to put the electrics into the house, you want to obviously select the electrician rather than the roofer, right? So there's kind of a planning and coordination problem. And if you do that, then you can actually achieve the overall goal. And, this is a very crude diagram, which is about as sophisticated as I get. And you could think about maybe there being, I don't actually have a pointer here, so you kind of just, imagine I'm pointing, different experts. And these, I'm just giving you an example of 4, but I think there are going to be many more. And these experts, as I said, are taking in information from the world, and they're operating on that information in different ways. And they're producing recommendations or policies for things that could be done in the world. And then you have the manager, which is your project manager of the house building type, that is basically then allocating control. So it's going to set weights, these W's here, over these experts proportional to how well they're doing on the task, right? So, for example, if expert 1 is not doing very well at all, it's not really giving you very good recommendations, well, maybe you can compare what it's predicting with actually what happens in the world. And if it's not doing well, then maybe you shouldn't give that one a lot of influence, right? So maybe you should assign weights proportional to the experts that maybe have the more reliable predictions, perhaps, or maybe have the best predictions about what you should do, okay? And so one of the arguments I'm going to talk about is that we can actually compare the performance, the predictions of the expert, what it says will happen, to what actually does happen as the agent is going through the world. And that will generate a prediction error, PE, for example, from each system. And those prediction errors then give an estimate, can be used to generate an estimate of how reliable is the expert in a given moment in time. Now, it's not going to be the case that, for example, expert 4 is always going to be the most reliable expert. As the environment changes, as the context changes, as the task or the goal of the the organism changes, maybe expert one will come into its own, right? So things can change over time. So you have to keep monitoring the performance of the experts and assigning control according to how well they're doing in a given situation. So I want to give you some examples of different expert systems from the work in my lab, but it's not meant to be a kind of exhaustive list. I think you can imagine many different expert systems that might be operating. So one of the areas we've been working on is experiential learning. So how do we learn from trial and error when we're interacting with the world? So like the school of hard knocks, we have to kind of learn through direct experience and getting, negative experiences and positive experiences. And there's no age limit, and the sooner we are graduated, the better for us. Okay. So one way that we've been thinking, and a lot of other people have been thinking about experiential learning, is with reference to a class of models called reinforcement learning, computational reinforcement learning. And two systems that people have focused on in this literature are what are called model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. So in model-based reinforcement learning, the idea is that we have an internal model, a cognitive map of the world. And within that internal model, we can basically make plans for what we want to do. So for example, if I put you in this house and you have a map of this house because you've familiarized with it, and you start in that green circle location, that room, and I say, well, I've put a big bag of cash in the laundry room, navigate your way to it, and you'd be able to do that in a model-based system because you know where the different locations are and you can make a plan for how you would get there. And this can be often contrasted with what's called model-free reinforcement learning, where basically the idea there is you don't have an internal model. Instead, you just take actions in the world. You do represent states and actions, and you just tend to take whatever actions gave you reward in the past. So if something worked out well for you in the past, you'll just do it again, okay? So in a way, it's sort of, stimulus response learning. You're just doing it without really thinking about the consequences. It's a very kind of automatic, non-deliberative way of performing. And a classic way, or it's now a classic way of distinguishing between these two forms of learning that originally was developed by Nathaniel Daw and colleagues and Peter Dayan, is the so-called two-step task. And many of you are probably familiar with it, but I'll kind of briefly take you through it. So the idea is that you start off in a starting position. And here, there's many variations of this task, but let me just try and use the pointer. So here you have these two spaceships, and you can select one of them, okay? And then you can, using those spaceships, you can visit one of two planets. And then you also then get to go down onto the planet, and you can mine locations for rewards, okay, which get you points, okay? And the thing is that it's a kind of a probabilistic task with probabilistic transitions. So what can happen is that, let's say you chose the yellow spaceship, well, 70% of the time, you'll go to the red planet, and 30% of the time, you'll go to the turquoise planet, okay? And vice versa if you choose the other spaceship. And where you can start to distinguish model-based from model-free strategies depends on what happens after you have experienced a rare or a common transition. So a common transition is a 70%, and the rare one is the 30%. So let me kind of take you through that very quickly. So let's say you were to, oh, the pointer has disappeared. Okay, oh, there it is. It's shown up again. Now it's disappeared again. Oh, there we go, okay. Oops, now I've gone on to another slide, all right. So imagine that you start here. You choose the yellow spaceship. You're intending to go to the red planet. but you end up on the blue planet, okay? So you've taken a rare transition, and then you go down to the surface and you experience a reward, okay? So the question is, what do you do on the next trial, okay? So if you're model free, what you should do is take the action that gave you reward last time, choose the yellow spaceship, right? Because you don't have a model, so you're just going to do that, okay? But actually, if you're model-based, what you'd realize is, well, I chose the yellow spaceship because I wanted to go to the red planet. And instead, I ended up on the blue planet. But if the blue planet is giving me more reward, maybe I should take the action that gets me to the blue planet. So I'm actually going to take the blue stimulus, okay? So when you have these kind of rare transitions that are occurring, what you do next kind of is indicative of whether you're taking a model-based or model-free strategy. So what Nathaniel Dawe showed is that if you kind of have a model that performs this task, let's say what he calls reinforcement here is model-free. So let's say you have a model-free agent does this task, it's basically not going to distinguish between rewarded events that were following common or rare transitions. Whereas a model-based agent is going to be more likely to select the same action or to switch after a rare transition, okay? So you have this kind of asymmetry in the choice. And if you look at behavior, human behavior tends to be a mix of these two. So it's a mix of these kind of model-based and model-free strategies. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about is, can we push behavior to being more model-based, model-free by manipulating the reliability of these predictions? Before I get to that, I'm going to introduce different types of learning signals within these systems. So classically, there's a signal called the reward prediction error, which many of you will be familiar, and it has been tied to the phasic activity of dopamine neurons. And so kind of this is probably one of the most famous slides in neuroscience that's showing up in a lot of talks. This is from Wolfram Schultz's work. Basically you have these phasic error signals that represent whether a reward is greater than expected or less than expected at the time when a reward should be delivered or not. And it has been argued or suggested that this could be, although I think this is very much debated now in the literature, it could be a signature of a model-free prediction error signal. Okay. But we can also talk about other types of prediction error signals, potentially. We can talk about a model-based reward prediction. Let me just take a step back. Say the idea behind this, of course, is not that this is just prediction error is just occurring and that's it, but the idea is that it's used to underpin plasticity, so that this dopamine signal then is projecting to areas, for example, in the striatum that might be representing information about stimuli and rewards, and it facilitates plasticity between those representations, which then enables learning to occur. So this reward prediction error is thought to underpin learning within the model-free system. We can also talk about model-based reward prediction errors. So all you have to do is just imagine that there is a model-based system that's making a prediction, and it's going to use planning, right? It's not going to be just reporting the difference between a kind of a cached expectation and an experienced outcome. Instead, it's going to make a plan, and you follow that plan and observe the outcome, and you can still have a prediction error. And that prediction error can tell you, well, did it go well or not? Did I get a reward, right, or not? Okay. Did I get more reward or less reward than I expected? So that could be another signal that might be useful. Now, interestingly, you don't need it for learning. You could use it. You could have a model where you would use it. But because if you're just planning in order to select your actions and you have a knowledge of the world and you know where the rewards are, you don't need to use this type of prediction error for actually guiding your learning process. So it might serve another purpose potentially. And we can also talk about other kinds of signals. within the model-based system. And one kind of signal is what we've come to call state prediction errors, okay? So state prediction errors aren't about rewards at all, okay? But they're still focused on surprising events. So imagine that I, am at the blue planet, and I'm expecting to end up at a particular landing pad. So I have a high expectancy, I'm going to end up here. And I do end up at that landing pad. Well, then I'm going to have a low state prediction error. So it's basically about how surprising am I for the new state in the world that I end up in following taking an action. But if I end up on the state that the landing pad that I wasn't expecting to end up at, well, then maybe I'm going to end up with a big positive prediction error, okay? And the idea is that that signal can be used to learn your transition model of the world. So learning about what's the probability if I'm in a given state and I take a particular action, that I'm going to transition to another state. And that's basically the signal that underpins learning of the world model. And we've done some work over the years, Jan Glacier, in collaboration with Nathaniel and Peter Diane. We looked for evidence for state prediction errors in the brain. Well, here's evidence for reward prediction errors, and we see them in areas that receive inputs from the dopamine system, for example, the ventral striatum. And we can also find these reward prediction errors in humans in areas where they're also found in animals. If you're recording from dopamine neurons in, for example, the substantia nigra or the VTA, here you can see an area of the substantia nigra in humans. This is a high resolution imaging protocol where we see these kind of prediction error signals. But we can also see state prediction errors, and we see those in our hands, at least, in slightly different parts of the brain, although there's arguments that you also find these kinds of signals also in dopamine neurons, in a certain class of dopamine neurons, or subtype. But we can see these state prediction errors in the cortex, particularly in the parietal cortex, posterior parietal cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that's kind of a very a typical place where we would see these types of signals. Okay, so Sang-Wan Lee, who was a postdoc in my lab a few years ago, wanted to come up with a model for how we might allocate or change control from model-based to model-free and from model-free to model-based as a function of the reliability of the predictions of these systems, okay? So the idea is that if you're going around in the world and let's say you, like me, you just arrived in Geneva yesterday, you have a very poor model of Geneva, but I'm hungry and I want to find somewhere to eat, right? So it's very hard for me to plan, at least before the era of cell phones with maps. But let's say I don't have that. So what do? Well, I can only maybe rely on my model-free system. So if I see a sign for McDonald's, maybe I'll go there. That would be a terrible thing to do. But anyway, I shouldn't say that. But that's maybe what I do. I'll rely on my model-free system to do that. Okay. However, sometimes if I'm in an unreliable situation where maybe my reward predictions are not doing well, I'm getting a lot of reward prediction errors, well, maybe I shouldn't rely on my model-free system. I should rely more on my model-based system. So the idea is that if I'm experiencing a lot of state prediction errors, say, my model-based system, my model might be unreliable. I shouldn't rely on that. Whereas if I'm experiencing a lot of reward prediction errors, maybe I shouldn't rely on my model-free system so much. And the idea is that you compute the reliability by essentially integrating over the history of prediction errors in the two systems. And then you allocate control over the two systems as to which one does the brain listen to guide behavior as a function of this reliability. So that was the kind of the idea behind Sang-Wan's model. And what we want to do here is test this in a relatively large sample behaviorally. So this was work with Wei Lun Ding and Jeff Coburn. Wei Lun is a PhD student who just finished, and Jeff was a postdoc in the lab who's just moved on to University of Iowa. And so we're taking this task and we're building in these additional manipulations to induce reliability, changes in reliability. So the way we do this is we manipulate in one condition reward magnitude. So basically, the amount of points that you get is varying across different conditions. So some situations you have higher rewards. So that means your reward prediction errors when you experience them are going to be higher. Or they're going to be lower rewards and you're going to get lower reward prediction errors, okay? So that's one manipulation. So we're hoping that that will make people in the high reward prediction error condition, it should make people less model free, okay? So the other thing we can do is manipulate the reliability of the transitions in the model. So let's say you're on the red planet and now there's a 90% chance you're going to transition to one particular landing pad. The argument is that that's a kind of a reliable situation. You know, most of the time you're going to end up where you expect to go. But in the other case, you have these uncertain state transitions where there's a 50-50 chance that you're going to end up on either landing pad. And that's maximally uncertain in this kind of binary world, okay? So the idea is that that should induce higher state prediction errors, which should make your model-based system less reliable. Okay. And we're also introducing another manipulation, basically where we're changing the reliability of the model-based system. Okay, so in one case, we're making the only thing that determines your reinforcement is the initial stimuli, okay, the yellow versus blue stimuli. Those other transitions have nothing to do with whether you get reward or not. And the idea there is that if you have a model, you're relying on that transition model, it's going to be not very reliable. So you're going to get a lot of model-based reward prediction errors, as opposed to a situation where the model is correct that you've been trained on. So all of these things are being manipulated across time in our task in different conditions. And we can basically then take people's data and we can look to see to what extent are they showing this behavior whereby they're changing their actions after a rare transition when they got rewarded, okay? And we can then look across these different manipulations, both the reward contingency, the reward magnitude or reliability, or the transition reliability. So reward contingency, remember, is about model-based reward prediction errors. The reward reliability is about model-free reward prediction errors. And the transition reliability is about these state prediction errors. And this is kind of hard to read, so I'm just going to plot it this way. So what this means is the higher the bar here, the more transition sensitive is the behavior. This is averaged across participants. So in other words, the higher the bar, the more model-based people are. The lower it is, the more model-free they are. And what you can sort of see is that if you look here on the left, we're looking at transition sensitivity for the model-based prediction errors. So if you have high model-based reward prediction errors, you're less model-based, okay? And if you go to the middle, if you have high reward prediction errors, you're basically more model-free, okay? Sorry, you're more model-based if you have high, even I get confused. And if you have high state prediction errors, you are less model-based, okay? So basically, in other words, we're seeing these shifts in behavior as a function of our task manipulation, suggesting that there's this dynamic arbitration process going on. Another thing that we can do is, because we have quite a large sample, is we can look across the sample at individual differences. And that's also quite interesting because if we just do a cluster analysis on people's behavior, we take a whole bunch of different behavioral indices on the task, including reaction times, the choice patterns, and so on. And we can just do a k-means clustering. And we see kind of an organization that looks like that if you look at the panel A up there. And falling out of that is basically what looks like 4 different clusters. So one cluster are essentially model-based, and in other words, they're basically mostly model-based in their behavior. They don't seem to have a great deal of model-free behavior at all. There's another group that look almost exclusively model-free, and then there's another group that are mixed, okay? And it's those mixture people that are really doing the arbitration. They're switching between model-based and model-free as a function of changes in environmental contingencies. So this arbitration capacity appears to have, at least in this task, it's a question of how stable this is as an individual difference. That's an open question. But what we're seeing is that you have the variation across people. So some people appear to be arbitrating and other people less so. And we can also look at the extent to which people are sensitive to these different arbitration variables as a function of what group they belong to. And again, it's not surprising, but the mixture group are sensitive to all 3 of these variables. The people that are model-free are generally not very sensitive to anything, except they are sensitive to reward reliability. So that does push their behavior a little bit towards being more model-based. Because remember, that's the signal that's associated with the model-free system. And the model-based people, they're very sensitive to transition reliability, but as well as to reward contingency, but less so than the mixture people. So again, it's, not only is there this variation in overall control, but also variation in the arbitration process and the variables that are driving arbitration across individuals. So what we're seeing here is in a relatively large sample, it's over 700 people that were tested online, we're seeing evidence for 3 different kinds of prediction errors that might be modulating arbitration. So you have both model-free reward prediction errors, which might push you towards being more or less model-based, depending on whether they're high or low, or transition errors, which drive you also towards either being model-based or not, as well as these more model-based prediction errors, which essentially tell you how well did I do when I did my planning? Did it work out well or not? And all of those things have kind of complementary information about how well I'm doing when I'm deploying these expert systems, which can then be fed into the reliability. Okay, so going from there, we thought about, well, could there be other kinds of learning that might be going on in humans that we might want to look at? And another kind of learning is observational learning, right? So I guess when we're children and when we're learning things, often we don't learn through direct experience, but we might learn from observing somebody else performing a task. And obviously that can be quite advantageous. It means we can learn a lot more stuff more quickly without having to actually go through the effort of doing them. But also it can be good from a point of view of avoiding things that might kill us, like eating poisonous berries or slipping on banana skins or what have you, right? Maybe it's good to observe someone else do that and learn from them rather than put ourselves at risk. Or also it's good if you see another compatriot foraging to get a reward and they find a good patch, maybe that's useful for us to know, and then we can also do that same thing. And maybe in the modern era, that's finding a good restaurant or a good supermarket to go to. So Carolyn Carpentier, who I think is coming to Geneva in a few months, who is also a postdoc in the lab, was interested in looking at this type of learning. And so we built a task which is basically combining observational learning with experiential learning. And our thought was that maybe the same type of arbitration process might go on between observational learning and experiential learning, as goes on between, say, model-based and model-free within the experiential learning domain. So the task was as simple as it could be, which is that you get to observe two stimuli, okay, these boxes, and the agent that you're observing opens one of these boxes and receives a token, okay? And the idea is that you know that that person knows what the reinforcement value is of those tokens. So one of these tokens, which could either be red or blue, orange or blue, is associated with a reward at one moment in time, and that changes across the experiment. So for some period of time, orange is rewarded, other periods of time, blue is rewarded. But you, as the player, don't know what the reward value is. So you can observe that agent, and you could make, well, I should say, you do know, sorry, I should say, you don't know, you don't have the objective information, right? The observer has the objective information. They know what the current reward value is. You get to observe them, but you also do get to choose from the tokens yourself directly, okay? And then you can get feedback, which might tell you which one is more rewarding, okay? So that's the experiential learning. And then you also have this observational learning. And what Carolyn did is she manipulated the reliability of these two forms of learning across the experiment. So at certain moments in time, experiential learning is more reliable, gives you more information about what the rewarded token is, and at other times, observational learning is actually more informative, okay? And we can also look at people's behavior. I don't really have time to go into the details of it, so I think you might have to look up the paper to get more into this. But basically, we can look at people's choices to see, did they choose in a way that's consistent with experiential learning, or did they choose in a way that's consistent with observational learning? And we can look only on those trials where these two types of learning make different predictions, which is a subset of trials. Some trials, both experiential and observational, will make the same prediction. Okay, so this is just another study that we ran online. This was, I think, on Prolific. And basically what we're looking at here is just, showing that people can learn this task. That after you start from after the last switch in the tokens, you can plot people's choice behavior, and they look like they're showing kind of learning curves. And then we can just look to see to what extent are you sensitive to the past outcome that you experienced directly? Does that influence your choice on the next trial? Or the partner's action, what the partner chose, okay? And you can see here that what you're seeing in the kind of panel E and F, these are two different replications of this study. Both of those things are actually driving behavior. So there's both an influence of experiential learning and an influence of observational learning. But also, if you recall, we're manipulating the uncertainty or the reliability of these two systems. And what we're showing you here on panel A and panel B, these are again two separate replications, is that if we manipulate uncertainty in either the experiential learning system, so you can see on the x-axis is OL uncertainty, low versus high. And on the y-axis, what we're plotting there is the proportion of choices consistent with observational learning. Only on those trials where these two systems make different predictions. And what you can sort of see is that the proportion of OL choices is elevated when OL uncertainty is low. And also that the proportion of EL choices is elevated when EL uncertainty is low as well. So both of these two different forms of uncertainty are changing the allocation of choices over the experiential and observational systems. The plots on the right are just another way of showing that using kind of a regression analysis. Okay. So again, and actually this was something that Carolyn actually pioneered. So the first study was not the first example of where we did this. What Carolyn did is she fit a bunch of different models to the data. So this is including a dynamic arbitration model that's changing the weights as a function of a change in the reliability, the predictions. There's a model that is just keeping a fixed weight, never changes, not sensitive directly to reliability. And then there's just a pure observational learning model, a pure experiential learning model, and just what we call a baseline, which just has a bunch of decision biases, like always go left or something, okay? Or always alternate. And basically what she's doing is fitting these models to each individual and basically categorizing a person as, you know, following a given model based on which model fits best in that individual. And what you can sort of see again is that there is this variation in the extent to which people exhibit dynamic arbitration over these systems. So what you kind of see over here in this on the right-hand side is basically a measure of how much people arbitrate based on the parameter in the model, in the dynamic arbitration model. Sorry, this is actually a measure of how much they're changing their behavior based on a regression analysis that's independent of the model, I should say. Apologies. And what you can sort of see here is that the higher this index, the more people are doing dynamic arbitration. And in the dynamic arbitration group, which is a decent subset, I guess, out of maybe this is about how many people in total? I guess it's kind of maybe 400, 500 people. We're seeing kind of about 130 of those are using dynamic arbitration. And you can sort of see that consistent with that, they're showing more evidence for this flexible arbitration as a function of uncertainty. Whereas these other groups, so there's some people that are only doing fixed arbitration, some people that are only relying mostly on observational learning and so on. So again, you're getting this kind of heterogeneity across people in the type of strategies that they're using. So I think it's important that, you know, once you have these large samples, you can start to see this heterogeneity in strategies that people are using. Now, it's also the case that those people that are using dynamic arbitration, which is what you can sort of see over here on the left on the bottom, they are the ones that actually perform best on the task. So they're kind of basically learning to select the optimal action more often than the other groups of people. So they're the best performing subjects, and they tend to be using the arbitration. Okay, so we can also dig in. So what we did there is we weren't distinguishing between different forms of observational learning, right? We were kind of just treating it as just one kind of learning. But actually you can dig in to observational learning, and you can think that maybe there's different forms of observational learning. So again, this is Carolyn's work. And what we wanted to do is kind of go to also a psychological literature that has a long tradition, where it's been argued that there are at least two forms of observational learning. Actually, I think there's more than that, but that's for the sake of argument, just stick with these two for now. One is called imitation, where I just copy what I see you doing. So if I see you perform an action, like lift up this bottle of water, then I'll just copy that. Okay? And that might work a lot of the time, right? Might be fine. But also, maybe sometimes it's useful for me to know what your goal is, right? So if I know that you are, for example, playing darts, and I don't know how to play darts, and I want to know, well, what should I do? Well, maybe if I see you aiming for, you know, the treble 20, maybe then I should learn to copy that, right? But I don't have to use the same action, because I could be in a different location. If I know that's your goal, then I can implement my own actions to get to that same goal. So the idea is that emulation is I'm learning something about the internal goals of an agent, and also learning about the rules of the world that that agent is engaging in. So I'm almost like developing a model of that agent and that agent's interactions with the world. And that's another way I could learn through observation. So then again, the question could be, do people arbitrate between these two strategies? And how does that work? So again, Carolyn, also in collaboration with Hyo-Yi Gaia, who is now an assistant professor at Columbia, which is a tough place to be right now, I have to say, unfortunately. So when they were in my lab, they developed this task. And basically, it's a bandit task. And the bandits basically deliver, again, different tokens. So here there's 3 different tokens, a red, a blue, and a green. And the colors on the bandits basically tell you what the probability is of getting a particular token. Okay, so if you choose the bandit on the left here, you're most likely to get the green token, a little bit less likely to get or a lot less likely to get the red, and very unlikely to get the blue one, okay? So you can get this distribution of tokens across the different bandits. And you get to observe someone else performing the task. One thing you could do is just copy what the other person does. So you get to observe the person, and then you get to play the task yourself, okay? So one strategy is that you could just copy whichever bandit the other person chooses, okay? And maybe that would work, okay? But the other trick, just like in the previous task, is that the tokens vary in how valuable they are across the task. So at any one moment in time, only one token is valuable. And you've guessed it, the observer knows, but you don't know what the currently valuable token is. So basically, again, you have to make this inference, if you want to solve the task this way, about given the observer's choices, what token is likely to be valuable at this moment in time. And that's kind of the emulation inference that you might make. And again, without belaboring the details, we manipulate the uncertainty, both of how you can infer which token is currently valuable. And the way you can do that is basically by observing the choices the person makes. And let's say they chose, if you look at, I'll try to see if I can get this, okay, we get the pointer to work. So let's say you're in this low token uncertainty condition. That means it's very clear if somebody chooses the slot machine on the left, they're very likely to be going for the blue token, right? They still could be going for the green one, but you've got higher chance of going for the blue one. Whereas on the right-hand side, you're much more uncertain because the distribution over the tokens is much more even. And so basically, we can manipulate the uncertainty about how easily can you emulate or infer which token is currently valuable based on the agent's choices. Or we can also manipulate the volatility of the person's actions just by manipulating the token values over time, switching them a lot. And that's, we thought, would manipulate the imitation system by making it less reliable. So don't have time to go into the details on the modeling, but basically we can fit a model that is doing this arbitration over these two systems, and we can compare this to a model that's only doing emulation or a model that's only doing imitation. And to make a long story short, we find that the arbitration model is fitting the data best. These are just two different ways of fitting models to the data. In the top row, it's basically the higher the accuracy of the model, the better it's doing. So the orange one is explaining the data better than the other two strategies. That's the arbitration. And in the bottom one, it's the group level BIC. So basically, the lower the value here, the better the model fit. So again, this arbitration appears to be driving behavior. But once again, and this is with Chan-Ying Wu, who's a graduate student with myself and Ralph Adolphs, who was co-advised by Carolyn Carpentier on this project, is that if we do take a large data set on this task online again, and we basically also do cluster analysis once again, what we can find is that, again, you get a mixture of behavior. You get people that don't really learn the task at all, people that tend to be mostly imitating, people that are mostly emulating, and also people that rely on a mixture that are doing the arbitration. So again, you're getting this kind of variation across individuals. And what's interesting here, I'm just giving you one example, is that this correlates with a measure of autism. So we kind of administered a questionnaire which captures autism-related traits. And basically, the higher in autism-related traits you are as an individual, the less you emulate. So actually, we're not seeing an arbitration effect directly. It's really just, you're just emulating less. Okay. So again, that's kind of consistent with other findings in the autism literature, but it shows you that this way of taking these computational models and using them to describe behavior can also be mapped in a meaningful way to individual differences. Okay, so I guess I shouldn't go on for too long, but let me quickly just talk about one other thing, and then I'm going to very briefly talk about some imaging results. So another type of arbitration that might go on is between a system which we think is important for helping you select actions in the world. So one of the problems is that if you're trying to learn in a new environment, or you have an AI that's trying to learn what actions to do, one of the major challenges, one of the reasons why reinforcement learning algorithms didn't take off for many years until deep learning came along, was the problem is, how do you recognize what the relevant actions are and find them? Because there could be an infinite number of actions available. Like instead of drinking this water, I could kick the table over, I could throw it up in the air, you know, I could do all kinds of things, right? And how do I know what the relevant actions are? For example, to pick up this bottle, right? And the idea is that you have these sets of priors over actions, which in the literature has been called affordances, which goes back to Gibson. And these affordances can act as priors, right? So a jerry can, you could pick it up. A nut, you can twist it, right? A computer, you can poke it, poke the keys, right? So what Sang-Yun Yi was interested in doing is trying to see, well, is there any evidence for the role of affordances interacting with reinforcement learning on this kind of task? So basically, he designed a task with a set of stimuli that have these different affordances. So let me give you an example. Let me go back here. So for example, you can see different objects here. So one object is, for example, this piano or electric keyboard, right? Or is it an accordion? Could be an accordion. And the idea is that you can press the keys, right? So that's an affordance that you might have. So we had three different actions: a pinch, a clench, and a poke. And we had different objects that basically have a primary affordance for one of those actions. And we recorded people's movements. So they could either do a clenching, a poke, or a pinching movement. And we could use AI to identify and classify their actions. And what we basically set it up kind of like a bandit task. So you see a stimulus, and there's different possible actions you can do, and one of them is going to be rewarded. Okay, but some of the actions are congruent, that in the reward, maximum reward is associated with, say, in the accordion, doing the poke. Or it could be incongruent, which is that maybe you should do a pinching action. Okay. So what we wanted to see is whether there's an interaction between the affordance and the reinforcement value. And again, we're kind of running out of time, so I don't want to go into too much depth on it. But basically, you can sort of see, if you look on the left-hand side, these are learning curves. And there's three actions. So chance should be like 33%. And what you can sort of see is we're splitting the conditions up towards whether there was a high amount of reward available in a trial, and whether or not you're seeing a congruent or incongruent action affordance, okay? And basically you see you basically show initial bias towards choosing the action that has a high reward probability in the congruent condition. And you actually kind of, if anything, impaired in the incongruent condition, okay? And so we can then fit a model to try and explain that. And actually, we weren't really expecting it to be an arbitration story because we weren't really manipulating arbitration at all. But what Sang-Hyun found, so one of the possible explanations could be just that maybe the affordance is causing a bias, acting as a prior in value learning, or it could be that it's acting as a bias in your action selection. Okay, so one thing is you happen to think the afforded action is more valuable. I'm going to choose that. Or maybe the afforded action, I'm just going to be more likely to take it, just as a bias, okay? Or it could be that maybe you're treating this as an arbitration between an affordance-based action selection system and a value-based action selection system. Turns out, to our surprise, that the arbitration models are the ones that are fitting the behavior best. And actually, Sang-Hyun decided he wasn't happy with the reliability model. So, against my wishes, he decided to go towards a different approach, I'm joking, a performance-based arbitration scheme. So here it's, instead of tracking reliability, it's just saying which of the systems overall, if that was in control, would generate more rewards. So it's kind of more like a reward-based maximization kind of system rather than reliability. And it turns out both reliability arbitration does well explaining behavior, but the performance one actually does better. So that might kind of add a wrinkle to our story about reliability. But we still think that both reliability and performance are important. So I should finish up. Should I finish now? Yes. Okay. All right. So just to make a long story short, we've looked for where arbitration is in the brain, and we see a region of ventrolateral prefrontal cortex that is tracking the reliability both in the experiential learning as well as in the observational learning. And we're seeing evidence that there's a connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the striatum that might relate to an inhibitory modulation of the system that's less reliable. So that's the story, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And I'm going to finish up. So what I've shown you today is evidence that there appear to be different mixtures of experts that are controlling behavior. I focus mostly on behavior today. And we think that we can also map these experts into the brain. So as I already alluded to, we see in ventrolateral prefrontal cortex correlates of the reliability signals, both model-based and model-free, as well as in the observational learning system too. There's a little wrinkle, which is that performance-based reliability appears to be elsewhere in the brain, still in prefrontal cortex, including anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So perhaps there's a network of systems that's involved in tracking different aspects of the expert's performance, which is then integrated to control and regulate which expert controls behavior. So I'm going to finish up and thank everybody in my lab who's contributed to all this work. I haven't featured Ava's work in my lab, which is also wonderful, which is about Pavlovian control, and also a similar story about different systems in the Pavlovian domain that might also be contributing. But I think you'd need another hour if I was going to get into that, so I won't. And thank you for your time.